Welcome back to episode 348 of the Tallboy Radio podcast. And as we always say, who knows where it goes when the beer flows? Well, that beer is flowing in another very interesting direction tonight as we're joined by another author. You know we love our books on Tallboy Radio. TBR, Tallboy Radio could also be called the Book Review. Unfortunately, that website is already taken. And the gentleman who I'm joined by tonight has written a very, very interesting book on a subject which I'm sure you will all find interesting. So his book is called Jack the Ripper, Edward Buckley, East End Thug, Gang Member. And his name is Jonathan Tye. Jonathan, would you like to say hello and tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Hi there. I'm, I suppose, a historian, a researcher, and a genealogist, actually, a combination of all three. I have a real passion for history, and I have a particular interest in the history of the East End of London in the latter part of the 19th century. And obviously, one of the big sort of components of that is the Jack the Ripper, the Whitechapel murders, the mystery of those murders that occurred. So the background to the book I've written is my research looking for a kind of a genesis for that killer, anything that could have led to what occurred and broke out in from the sort of bank holiday, April bank holiday in 1888 that led through to the autumn of terror and beyond. And that's kind of how I come up with looking at a gentleman by the name of Edward Buckley, and that's where my research led me.
Yeah, excellent. Now, I think most people out there are familiar with some of the more common names that people who are suspected to be Jack the Ripper. And I'm pretty sure anybody who's tuning into this podcast has heard of Jack the Ripper, knows a little bit about the legend, probably knows some of the names of some of the victims there because they're just as famous perhaps as he is, although we do know the identity of those, which is where the difference occurs. So just recently, my cousin was over from Texas and he came over with two pals of his. And we went down to London and we headed up throughout the UK. We had 12 days visiting different historic sites in the UK because they wanted to see a little bit of history. So when we started off in London, they're all police officers, I should say. I said to them, tell me what you want to see. And the one thing that they all said categorically was number one on their list. Can we do a Jack the Ripper tour? Can we find out a little bit about Jack the Ripper? So I looked into it, and we did. We went and visited the sites of where all the bodies were found. And obviously, unfortunately now, there's the shopping centres and what have you in the area. It's a shame, isn't it, to see those sites which are so historically significant or certainly of interest aren't really there anymore.
I mean, the city is gradually encroaching upon the area where the murders occurred, which is actually it's three sort of boroughs or three areas of the East End, which was Spitalfields, Whitechapel itself, and St George in the east. And every time I've taken people on tours, and as you go up there, you can see that gradual encroachment of these large buildings to the edge of Spitalfields. But there is still a lot there. You'd be surprised. A lot of the murder sites have all but disappeared, but you can still walk down what was Bucks Row and get a sense of things. You can still walk down the long Whitechapel Road. There's Castle Alley or Castle Street still there, which is associated with one of the murders. And there's some small turnings that have still got the original Huguenot buildings, because that's what the sort of the architecture was at the time of the Ripper. And you've got some of the main streets that he would have walked down, Fashion Street, which has got the Queen's Head pub on the corner, which was restored actually. So, and of course, there's the famous 10 Bells pub where the victims were said to drink. So you can still get a real feel for the atmosphere. So I'd still recommend anyone go down there. With regards to the tours, you may have been hopefully lucky in terms of who you got. When you listen to some of the tour guides speak, you get a lot of inaccuracies and you get a lot of exaggeration, which is a real shame. But there is a core of very good guides. So there's a lady called Lindsay Siviter that's extremely well known, that know their history of the Ripper murders absolutely back to front, and more than just the Ripper murders, the history of the area. And you have to have a passion and knowledge of the area in order to talk about the murders.
Yeah, the guy we had, I will say this for him. We thought he was fantastic, and as far as I know, certainly my knowledge on this subject is nothing compared to yours. He seemed really, really knowledgeable, and the guy he spoke about was it was a relative of a friend of his, so that was certainly an interesting aspect that he brought to it.
It's
But yeah,
interesting.
he brought a very he brought a very he was very theatrical the way he told it. He could project his voice. He was dressed in the outfit at the time, and he looked authentic, and he
Right.
certainly sounded authentic. And certainly to my American cousin and his friends, they really enjoyed the theatre that he brought to it as well. It was really good. You mentioned the
There's an
10.
enormous sorry, beg your pardon.
No, I was just going to say, you mentioned the 10 Bells pub there. And yeah, so that is a place where Jack the Ripper himself may very well have enjoyed a beer, or at least visited or inhabited at some point, we believe, don't we?
Yeah, the pub does feature in particular it's the Mary Kelly murder. Mary Kelly she's known as the canonical fifth victim. She might not have been the fifth victim. She could have been the sixth or the seventh victim. But on the morning after her murder, one of the women that live in Miller's Court where the murder took place, the first place she headed to at sort of 5:15, 5:30 a.m. in the morning, because pubs were open then for the market traders and the market porters, was the 10 Bells. She went straight in there and had her first drink. There was a major problems with alcoholism amongst a lot of the women of the area that were the victims. They're kind of loose. The best term for them is to call them unfortunates, because that's what they were known as at the time. And Annie Chapman, who was the second canonical victim, was also said to be drinking in there, either I think on the morning, or it's been seen in there on the morning of her murder. So it's possible that one or more of the women certainly had used the pub. It was a very familiar sight. Catherine Eddowes, who was a victim on the night of the double event when two women were killed, had pawned some boots in Jones's pawn shop, which is still there. You can still see the signage, and that's just a couple of doors on, I believe, from the 10 Bells. So she would have known the 10 Bells pubs. So the pubs that still remain along that commercial street strip have an association with the victims. Even Elizabeth Stride is probably drunk in the 10 Bells. With regards to the Ripper, the Whitechapel murderer, I'm pretty sure that he would have drunk in the 10 Bells pub as well. If you've gone in there for a drink and you go downstairs to the loos, it's pretty spooky. It has a real eerie feel when you go down, and you have to kind of walk up a bend in the stairs as you go back into the pub. I don't know if you know a lot about the history of the pub, but when the area was really at its worst in the 70s, it was briefly renamed the Jack the Ripper to kind of cash in on the history of the murders. And there's one of the leading experts in our subject, Paul Begg, used to stay in that pub as well during that period when he used to roam those streets. I'd love to have roamed the streets. I think I first went up in 1985, 86 with a friend, and it was so run down, and a lot of the sites were still left. But to have gone there in the sort of 70s, I think would have been fascinating. You could have picked up a property in Spitalfields for probably a couple of £1,000s. They're worth millions now in the 70s.
Yeah, we were down one of the rows of the terraced houses, and the guy said that these properties will set you about £2 to £3 million. And it's like, if you'd hung on to those from that time period, you'd be in for a few coins there. You certainly
Exactly.
Yeah,
if only we could time travel, I think I would have.
Yeah, definitely. So, Jack the Ripper, then. There's a number of murders that happened in UK history, and a few capture the imagination, quite like Jack the Ripper. What do you think it is that really does get people as interested and as fascinated in his story?
I think it goes right back to the beginning of when they occurred, because they occurred at the dawn of the explosion in the mass media of the newspapers as a form of media. So all of a sudden, papers were being read avidly by all sections of society, and the working classes was starting to read the papers. So the sensationalism of those stories, it came along at the right time. I think there was a newspaper that circulation and readership exploded as a result. So you've got that happening in 1888 itself, and then you've got the mystery, the unknown, and you've got the stories of what happened going out across the world very quickly. So you mentioned your American American cousin visited from Texas. The Americans in particular to this day are extremely interested in the subject. A lot of the groups that I'm on and part of that discuss the murders have many American followers. So you've got that element, and of course there's this how the myth evolved, and then you've got those where the gaps needed to be filled in terms of not knowing who the killer was. You've got the royal theory of a conspiracy, the Masonic theory, and that draws even more people in. And then obviously in the 60s and 70s we had those wonderful films I was talking about to you just before we started, that I grew up watching, Murder by Decree with Christopher Plummer, where Sherlock Holmes investigates the murders, and it is something to do with the royal family. And there was one called Study in Terror in the mid 1960s. So that's kind of giving it the sort of a legendary status, and it continues to entice and draw people in. And there's those out there that falsely, I have to say, claim that they've solved the mystery. There's a fake shawl story that's going around at present, which is a real shame for the true history of the subject. But there's always going to be people that are interested. And every time a book comes out, like my own, the press will take interest, and there will be people interested in reading what we have to say.
That's great. I mean, it's fantastic that there's that many people out there, and that the story's gone abroad, over to the States or what have you, where they have their own fair share of murderers over there.
Yeah.
To pick up. But that, like you say, the dawn of the time of the British press, the newspapers were salubrious and celebrated and sensationalized the story themselves. And then, like you say, the very mystery of not knowing who it was, the royal element. Do you put any? I mean, I know you have your own theory, but do you put any credence in those ideals?
No, I mean, what I do in the opening chapter of the book is the sort of the myth. Demolishment of the myth that's grown up around the Ripper, and I've tried to give each element of that myth its origins, how it grew. There is absolutely no connection whatsoever to the royal family or to the suspect that I think was originally was pointed around the Duke of Clarence, which was who would have been the heir to the throne, but he died, I think, in 1892. And then it was attributed possibly to his the Queen's surgeon, Sir William Gole, who was an old man who had suffered a stroke during the times of the murders. And then there was individuals around that royal circle, the painter Walter Sickert, and then I think there was a poet tutor as well that the Duke of Clarence had. So they've emerged out of that, but these were inventions of the sort of the 1960s and 1970s, where the sensationalist books came out. The most famous book of all is the Stephen Knight book that came out, The Final Solution. What a great title, where he wrote this conspiracy theory up of a Catholic royal baby that meant that these women who had conspired to blackmail or look after the child had to be killed. Brilliant story, but a cleverly made up tale. There are elements of real events that did occur. There was a very real raid on a male brothel in Cleveland Street, where Inspector Aberline, who did investigate these Ripper murders, was involved. And there was an element of cover up, because there were people high up in society that were and could have been named. And I think the Duke of Clarence was loosely dangled about. Whether or not he was involved at the time, I'm not sure. So that did occur, and I think elements of that story have been very cleverly merged with the Ripper mystery that was occurring at a similar period, and that's part of that growth as well. But unfortunately for everyone, there is no real credence in any royal conspiracy. But I could say this to you 100 times, and there will still be someone on the street. If you walk around those streets of Whitechapel and on them tours, who say it was, I go, it's something to do with the royals. It's part of how it's part of our culture. It's part of the cultural history of the subject.
Yeah, it is. It's become attached to it, rightly or wrongly. It certainly sounds wrongly. And what about the Masonic element then as well?
Yeah, I mean they're kind of inextricably linked. And what happened with the Masonic theory is that there are some senior Masonic individuals. I think Charles Warren, that was the overall in charge of the police at the time, was a Freemason. But this comes down to how the women's bodies, particularly Annie Chapman and Catherine Eddowes, were treated. Their entrails being thrown over their shoulders, etc. And this interpretation of the graffiti in Galston Street that happened on the night of the double event, where the Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing, or words thereabouts. They weren't photographed. They were rubbed off. It was a chalk message. And the spelling of Jews, J-U-W-E-S, has led people to believe it's to do with a Masonic message. Again, I can't see any connection. For me, it was if it is connected to the murders, I think it possibly is. That it was graffiti at the time. I think the person meant Jews, not Jewes or anything of that kind. As to regard to how the bodies were treated, I don't think there's any symbolism. This killer attacked the woman's femininity, and those parts of their body were just in the way, and they were just tracked randomly, whether it was over a left shoulder or a right shoulder. There's no symbolism in that at all.
No, so you mentioned the victims themselves, and you mentioned the horrific nature of the injuries. Certainly, the later victims had inflicted upon them. They were pretty nasty crimes, weren't they?
Yeah, I mean the object of the killer was what happened after they were killed. So the main aim of this killer was to silence them and to end their life, in order that he could carry out the fantasies that he wanted with their body. So the actual act of murder, whether it was like a garroting or a brief strangulation and then the throat being cut, what happened after to their body, after their death, that interested the killer. And it was a horrific slashing and attacking of their, as I say, when I say their femininity, I mean their female parts, if that makes sense. And that gives a sort of a sexual element to this killer. There are sexual attacks on these dead women.
Yeah, like you say, utterly gruesome wounds that are inflicted upon them. And I think also there is a dark nature to all of us that is intrigued by the psychology of someone who would do that, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean that the key to this, and it's a question we can long debate. And as a psychology, the subject of psychology moves forward, and our understanding of serial killers moves forward, we get closer, perhaps, to understanding the nature of this killer. But the individual was clearly a complex person that had major issues towards women, and there's a type of women that he's attacking. In terms of their age profile, Mary Kelly is an exception, because she's believed to be younger, sort of 25, 26 years old. Most of these women are sort of 40 plus, 40 to 45 years old, a bit slightly older. So it's almost like a mother, perhaps a mother figure that he's attacking. But what they had in common was alcohol. They all had a tendency, and I think I explore it in the book, all had a tendency to be quiet, I suppose, and easygoing when sober, but when under the influence of drink, they could be volatile and loud. I would suggest that's possibly a trigger, and that's not to forgive the actions of the murderer, but I think that's part of his psychology, this reaction that maybe he have got from the women. In my own opinion, that this killer would have had successful liaisons with unfortunates or prostitutes, many more than were murdered. And I think because he had a good understanding of the area where he was being taken or led to, and he knew those streets well. And it's possible that to at least some of the victims, he was a familiar face. I mean, they may not have known him deeply, but I think he probably would have been a familiar face in the area.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. That for I guess when alcohol plays a part, though, that these women need the money, to pay for their lodgings for the night or what have you. They they can get pretty desperate and take anybody on board. But there's a good chance, like you say, this wasn't his first rodeo, to use a Texan expression there. That he was familiar with the area. He'd been with perhaps these women before, and if not those, then certainly similar in that area. So just taking you back there a little bit then. So you mentioned the graffiti on the wall. The other famous little bit of a clue that was sent there, the Dear Boss letter. What do you make of that?
To this day, there's a real debate as to whether they were real or made up. Most people would believe, and I think some the early police people high up in the police thereafter, after the time, suggested that they were written by journalists, basically to give a name to the killer, because we get the name Jack the Ripper from the letters that were sent, and also it kept a rolling interest in the press in what was going on in Whitechapel. So you get the first sort of names that appeared, the Whitechapel Fiend, and then suddenly you had Leather Apron. It was so up until the double event, this killer had been known as Leather Apron, and then suddenly this letter arrives, and Jack the Ripper is the name. They were given credence by the fact that the one of the letters seems to foretell this double event, this two murder process. But in terms of how the postal service back then was a lot quicker and more efficient than ours is today, so that could have been easily sent out after the event.
That's a depressing thought in itself.
Yeah, the fact that plenty of postal service back then.
That is depressing. That's probably the most depressing part of this story. Yeah, it is. So before we get to your book, we touched on the theory, and we found out a little bit about Edward Buckley. I just want to briefly mention a book that was probably, as we mentioned earlier in the green room at the start, present in both our earlier lives, and that's the Diary of Jack the Ripper. So yeah. James Maybrick, the character of James Maybrick. We were saying, you wrote, when you read it, you had a pretty good clue that it was false. I was disappointed to find out that it was fake.
Yeah, I mean, this subject is very, very broad indeed, and it creates interest from those who are academic, genuine historians on one hand, and you have got at the other end of the extreme, there is a crackpot element that is drawn in by the darkness of the killer. It's almost slightly perverse in my opinion. And in the middle, you've got various opinions. So it's always interesting to listen to all those opinions and take them on their merits. But there's also an element of a money-making element, as there have been in all events throughout the whole of history. So if anyone can make a buck out of a big story, and I do believe the Maybrick Diaries very much falls within that field. I think if I recall our younger years, I think there was Hitler Diaries that suddenly appeared in a similar period. Yeah. So in terms of, again, we spoke off camera beforehand, and I was extremely excited about the book. I couldn't wait to read it. I thought, have we found a solution at last? You have these parallels between the areas in Liverpool that had similar names to the areas in the East End, and it's connected to another known case at the time. This is Florence Maybrick, who I think poisoned her husband, I believe, isn't she? But then you read the diary, and it's clearly just made up with subtleties that mean you cannot delve beyond the words that are there to proving conclusively either way. And I'm pretty sure that thereafter it was admitted that it was a clever forgery, wasn't it? But whilst things like that add to they draw in the viewer, they draw in interest, they draw people into the subject, which is a healthy thing, because hopefully those people will go on to read other books and learn more. The negativity of it is it takes the subject away from where I'd like it to be. I'd like it to be serious history, because he represents the Whitechapel murders are they are almost like a torch that is shined on a period and on people that you and I would never have known about had it not been for this killer. And that's the terrible irony of it all. The lives of Elizabeth Stride, of Mary Kelly, Polly Nichols, Emma Smith, Frances Coles, we would not have known about those women's lives and how bad they were, and how they sort of fell into the abyss of the East End had it not been for the Whitechapel murderer. So it's been a fantastic tool for opening up a period in history we know little about. And when you search for, what those individuals in the archives, or when you're trying to find clues to Jack the Ripper, what you're reading about is the social history of the East End. And that is an interesting story in itself, that, even today, and I've been doing this subject a long time now, you're constantly learning and finding new information and small stories about how these people lived. There was some real depravity. Some of the districts were horrendous. We can't even contemplate how bad they were.
No, it's interesting you say that, though. That is one of the things I suppose I hadn't thought about. We know these victims, we know a little bit about them, but if it wasn't for the act of this one person, then their lives would have passed completely irrelevant to us. The stories that they're told, the history, and that's one of the things that we talked about on the tour, funnily enough, was actually we heard some of the tales and how people lived at that time, and it was pretty shocking. It was pretty shocking. You think you have an idea, but then you stood in the area and you could suddenly picture it. And the guy had the projector and he was showing the pictures on the wall. Unfortunately, it was May, so it was very bright and they were difficult to pick out. But you saw it. It really was an eye opener. And just to touch on another point that you made there, about the diary of Jack the Ripper, bringing in people to the story, and hopefully then they find out the truth afterwards. He might bring people in. We had a guy on the podcast who was a Billy the Kid historian. He has a foundation in New Mexico where he raises money for graves of the regulators there. And we asked him about things like young guns and and the stories and how inaccurate they were at points. Did it frustrate him? And he said no, because that's how I got interested in it.
Yeah.
And then I found out the truth, and so many other people have done exactly the same thing. So that's interesting, that, isn't it?
Yeah, it's exactly. I would agree with you entirely. Films like From Hell, which with the Johnny Depp film, what they do is they draw people who suddenly think, oh, I'd like to know more about that, or read more about that, or look it up, and suddenly you've got people that are becoming interested in the subject, which is fantastic.
Yeah, I think the more people that can bring opinions and ideas and research to the area, you never know. Maybe, will it be solved, you think, or is that part of the charm of it, that it never can be properly?
Within this field, you get these debates about whether or not we want it to be solved. I think at the heart of it, we'd all like to know the answer to the mystery. The mystery in terms of how we're growing with AI as a tool, and how we're growing with the records that are being put online, such as the newspaper archives and the ancestral documents, etc. It is possible, I think, that one day, as a combination of looking at probability, we could narrow down the number of people to who it could have been. There was a great researcher that sadly passed away called Christopher Scott, and he kind of back in the 2000s, he did an experiment looking at men of the right age in the area that we all think this killer would have lived. Most of us, that's in those notorious streets around the lodging houses in Flower and Dean Street, Fashion Street, George Street, Thrall Street, and he compiled a list of about 200 men, and I thought that was brilliant. Ironically, within that list, completely separate, and I'm not trying to sell the book here, was not Edward Buckley, but his brother John Buckley was in that list. He was one of the 200 men that he sort of identified, which is interesting. But in terms of your question, the longer we move away in time, obviously, the less likely we're going to find concrete evidence. But in terms of what we've got, in terms of the growth of intelligence that can look at documentation and scan information, I think it might be possible to narrow it down. But we'll see.
Well, to quote Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who made the films of the 50s and 60s there, who's hunting Jack the Ripper, Sherlock Holmes. So once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, Must be the truth.
Yeah, exactly that.
Indeed. So, well, let's look at one of those candidates, one of those ones, one of those pieces of evidence that AI can use to discern whether this is indeed the man who did it. Is the book that you've written yourself. Did you want to tell us about Edward Buckley then? Because I think most people who know a little bit may know this gentleman. Most people who know the name of Jack the Ripper may not necessarily know too much about Edward Buckley.
So this is how this came about. So what I did was I avidly looked at press reports prior to 1888 to look for some spark or some incident, because most of these killers will have not just started and then there would have been something before. If you look at Peter Sutcliffe, there are incidents in the build up. So I came across purely by accident. I came across a guy that had stabbed a woman in the abdomen. So that's one of the key words I've been looking at: the abdomen, and a stab to the abdomen of a woman named Frances Jones in Sparrocks Row. Now, Sparrocks Row is not in the East End; it's across the river in Borough, not far from London Bridge. It was absolutely completely obliterated in the Blitz in the Second World War. But within this narrow street, this woman was heard to cry by a policeman, "Help! Murder!" And standing over her with a knife was this chap called Edward Buckley. So the story grabbed my attention. So what you do is you've got the names to go on. You've got Edward Buckley, you've got Frances Jones. You read about what happened, and then you can cross-reference with other reports. Now, one of the things the report said was that Edward Buckley was not actually from the London Bridge area at all. He was from the East End. He was from Tarling Street in St George in the East, and he'd enticed this woman. The papers give you the impression that they're in a relationship, and they possibly was, but she was an unfortunate. She was a sex worker. She didn't press charges, so the issue sort of thereafter dropped. So in the meantime, I go away and I study what I can find out. So Frances Jones lived on the Whitechapel Road in number 239 in a coffee house. Now, for anyone who knows the period and knows the history, a coffee house in the East End in the 1880s was not Costa Coffee or Starbucks. They were thinly veiled brothels. So you would go in, or you'd be taken back by a woman. You'd pay a fee to the landlord or the person that ran the coffee house, and there were quite a few in the East End. They made a fortune out of these girls. They would take their share of the money. Anyway, so living in 239 was Frances Jones and another young lady called Ali. I think her name was Alice Watkins. So you had these two unfortunates. On the 1881 census, their role is given as, or occupation is do not know, which is very unusual for the time. So anyway, so Edward Buckley. Then I find further in reports of Edward Buckley trying to get in this coffee house in Whitechapel Road. So he'd assaulted a policeman outside. He'd assaulted the landlord, a guy called Thomas Walton. So you had the buildings of something going on there in terms of an attack with a knife on a woman. But this continued. This strange behaviour. So, and it basically got worse. So the following year, in October, in 1885, Edward tracks her down to another brothel in Devonshire Street, number 5 Devonshire Street, which was one of the blackest streets. It's gone now, long gone, for the Watney Market, down in St George in the East. Now, we was talking earlier about how bad the area was. You cannot begin to imagine how bad Devonshire Street was. Every single house, more or less, was a brothel. They were also they were laundering stolen goods and stolen money, so that was a part of it as well. So your thieves would put their money through there, or they'd be hidden there as well. the women were often on the streets, and there was women known as some of these unfortunates or prostitute women were known as trippers up. So they would take a man back, a sailor, or there's even a case of a Texan who had come over to the East End for, I don't know, one of the cattle markets or something, and they were taken back to these brothels in Devonshire Street, and they were robbed and beaten. So anyway, Edward enters this brothel number 5, and incidentally, there is a connection here, because along that street, Elizabeth Stride and Michael Kidney, one of the victims, also stayed. And I believe there's possibly a loose connection between Frances Jones and Elizabeth Stride. Anyway, so he enters and he carries out the most horrific attack with a knife and a stick, attacking her private parts. When she's found by the police, when the room is full of blood, she sort of holds her hands up. She's been viciously attacked. One of her eyes is bulging out. He's taken a knife and he rips it across her nose and down her cheek. If you look at the images that I've created in the book, it's almost like a mirror image in life to the knife wound that Catherine Eddowes had when she was found. The knife is dragged across. Edward obviously flees and walks away. Now, at the time, he's living at 14 Hanbury Street, and we know that that's just along the way from where Hanny Chapman is killed. So he knows this area extremely well. From his window in Hanbury Street at the very top of the building, he would have only had to look right along, and you'd have seen that entrance to number 29. It was almost like a revolving door, often used by people to sleep rough as well as for sexual activity. He would have been very familiar with that. So anyway, the police arrived the next day, and his views are well, we call them disgusting in terms of our modern outlook. He says, "Why am I'm being arrested for a brass?" And I think he uses a brass now in the Cockney he uses. And then he's put away, obviously, and then when he's eventually released, but he goes away for something else, which we can talk about. But he's back active in Whitechapel from February 1888, and he has another altercation with Frances Jones in May 1888. But what's interesting about this one is that he's carried out a number of incidents where he's beat and attacked this woman. In the early 1880s, the press are quite sympathetic. So one of the headlines were quite appalling. It said, "Serves her right," in terms of what she got a beating in a pub just along the Whitechapel Road. The headlines in May 1888 were, "Serves him right," because he was caught again by the police. And that, I wondered, I have speculated if that humiliation of that has led to the events that occurred. There's a lot more to his life, but that gives you an outline of the violence in the man. In terms of that attack within the room at number 5 Devonshire Street, the use of a stick or a poker or a walking stick, that's used on her private parts. There are some parallels with the early attacks in the Bank Holiday Monday attack on Emma Smith in April 1888. And I say the knife attacks he carries out on her face. There is, in my opinion, strong parallels to what occurred with Catherine Eddowes. So this is what drew me to this character, and then it's learning his psychology thereafter. And he is a street thug, and he's a pickpocket, and he's a gang, a local gang thug. They go away on events. In the bank holiday phenomena had only just started in Victorian England, so you have the working classes going off to the Crystal Palace and the Epsom races, but for a pickpocket, they went off to rob on those days, and they would come back laden with money, and they would then spend that on unfortunates and women of that nature. You could call now Tom Westcott, who wrote the Bank Holiday Murders about the Jack the Rippers, said that gave the tag to the early murders to Bank Holiday Murders. Now you could almost call Edward Buckley a bank holiday thief, because when he's arrested again in April 87, it's actually on a bank holiday for robbing at Epsom. So, and he took quite a lot of money during that day. It was never recovered. So these guys are going away in gangs, and they're operating in these places and then coming back to the East End. So there is a lot to him, but his psychology is interesting, because he gets involved in a gang fight in February 1882 in Fashion Street. could have been the Queen's Head pub where Elizabeth Stride was drunk. I don't know if when you were taken on your tour, did they tell you about George Hutchinson and seeing Mary Kelly under the lamplights at the corner of Fashion Street? So
Yes.
this was a street where Jack the Ripper walked. Jack the Ripper knew that street well. So he's involved in a fight in February 1882, probably over takings from pickpocketing or whatever. But during that, he takes a knife wound to the abdomen, which is quite serious. Goes to the commercial Free Hospital, Metropolitan Free Hospital, and he as a result of that, I think that his potency or his sexual abilities were curtailed. Now, in terms of, is there evidence for that? He was being treated for something I find so difficult to pronounce, but it's in the book, hermatocoly, which is like a general swelling of the genitalia. It would have caused it to look deformed, and it would have affected his ability. Now, if you think about the nature of those attacks on women, there is an element of the man using a weapon almost in a potent manner, because there was no semen found on these women. There's not an actual act of sexual penetration. He's doing it with his hand and a knife. So for me, there is that aspect of Edward Buckley that is more complex than a normal common thief or street robber. But the tools he's got are the ability to know the police beats of the East End. He's from that Irish Cockney community that grew up in St George's of the East. And he would have known the garroting method, because I know he carried out a garroting robbery that some people say was the way the women were subdued, which is to grab them and silence them by the neck. So there's a lot to him.
Yeah, I mean, there is. And certainly, so the title of the book is interesting, because one of the things that we know about Jack the Ripper was, certainly with the blade, there's the idea that the way he cut, whether it was fictional or fact, that he had surgeon-like accuracy. And then when the title of the book with this chap being East End Thug, you think, could that carry over? Can those two things run concurrently?
Well, I mean, I take the Thomas Bond view of this, which is Dr. Thomas Bond looked at all the autopsy reports that were available for the canonical 5 women, and he looked at Mary Kelly. He didn't believe that the killer had any surgical or medical knowledge at all. So, again, part of the myth of this subject is the growth in the doctor with the shiny black bag and the dark overcoat and the top hat, a medical student, etc. It was looked at the time. It is still open to debate, so I've got to be fair and say there are still some who would say yes, that he did display some knowledge. I went to a conference a couple of years ago now, and I'm listened to Stephen Keogh, so I'd recommend reading his book, Murder Investigation Team. It's a program that's on television. Now, for him, the attacks that were carried out on those women, to use an awful word on this, and I apologize, were masturbatory. He was doing this, and that's what it was. That was the be all and the end all. Yes, some organs were removed, but I think they were as a consequence of his ferocity and probably curiosity as well. So for me, I don't think he required any medical knowledge whatsoever.
Interesting. I mean, certainly the story you've told there, and I use the word story almost disrespectfully there, so I apologize for that. But the information you've given us of an individual who certainly had motivation, certainly had previous, was in the area at the time, had a bit of a track record for doing these things, and not only that, the idea that it'd be a member of the royal family, we know there's a few ne'er-do-wells in the royal family. Let's not go down that route. But there's a much more likelihood that this individual was from the area where he carried out, those who clumsy psychologists and criminologists like myself, when they watch things like Silence of the Lambs, what do people cover? It's what they know, what they see around the day to day. That's where they first learn and they carry out these first crimes. So we shouldn't be too surprised that this individual probably came from that area itself.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the remarkable narrowness between some of the murders occurring between what a policeman arriving at one end of the street or the other. If you look at the situation with Polly Nichols, you had PC Neal arriving at one end, and then I think it was PC Thwain at the other end of the street on their beat. So these policemen would have had set beats as they walked around. They would have, every now and then they'd be reversed and they'd walk a different route. But policing then, the coverage was again far different from today, where you very rarely see a policeman on the street. There was plenty around. You had guys on fixed points as well that stood in one place only, and they were always there, so you could go and report to them. But this killer seems to be able to have carried out these murders between the footsteps of these policemen on every occasion. There's a murder that most believe would probably be attributed to him after Kelly, Alice Mackenzie, and the policeman literally, I think, had literally just gone off for a bite to eat and came back and to find the body. So whoever was the killer knew, in my opinion, the police beats. Now, going back to my own book, if you notice on the title, I have put a question mark. Yeah. I don't want to. I've never wanted to approach this. That a lot of the Ripper books will say this is who did it, and then they'll give a narrative of their of the story of this, whoever their chap is. That's the wrong way to go about this. This is giving an idea of someone I think would be a good suspect. What I would say to you is, if it wasn't Edward Buckley, where I am extremely confident, if not Ed Buckley, it would be from another person from that community that killed those women, another person that had grown up within the Irish community, most likely of St George in the East End, that grew up in that depravity where sexual transactions of women was evident everywhere on the street, because that's how those women unfortunately had to make a living, or the only way they could. I'm pretty confident that if not Edward Buckley, it would have been someone extremely like him. But I think there is some complexities within his psychology that make him a particularly good suspect.
There certainly is. There certainly is. Like you say, there's the motivation there. You know, to be fair to you, you've done some fantastic research. How difficult was it to come across all that information?
It's like an addiction, to be honest with you. You get a name, you get a sort of a grab of a story, and you just want to follow it through, and you want to know everything there is. So in terms of Edward, he's been mapped out from cradle to grave. I've even been to where he's buried he's ironically buried in the same cemetery as Mary Jane Kelly, in a common communal part of the cemetery, in an unmarked grave. He died in the 1920s, but so he's extremely well mapped throughout the press. When he's finally caught he's finally captured sort of his last big spell of prison is 1909. But it's where he's caught and where he's arrested that's of interest to people that study the Ripper. He's arrested on a place called Gardener's Corner. And I don't know if you know what Gardener's Corner is or was. Gardener's Corner was a famous general store, or like the equivalent of a Selfridges, or a department store on the corner of Commercial Street, Commercial Road, and the Whitechapel Road. It stood until 1973 when it burnt down. Very iconic. So it's still, most people, a lot of EastEnders would go, "Now I meet you at Gardener's Corner," and I'm sure a lot of the older community still say that. So he was arrested there. Now from that point there, in terms of where these murders occurred, you could quickly gain access to every single murder site. So to the west, you had towards Aldgate, Mitre Square and Catherine Eddowes. Going east, you had Castle Alley, where Alice Mackenzie was murdered. Then you had George Yard with Martha Tabram, the corner of Osborne Street, where Polly Nichols is last seen, and Emma Smith is attacked. So you go along these roads, and you drop down to Commercial Road, turning off there, you've got Elizabeth Stride's murder. So that's where he was arrested in 1909, and that's where he was pickpocketing and where he was operating from. And that's where, I think a gentleman called Edward Stowe used the term the super highway of where these murders occurred. He put it slightly to the north along Wentworth Street. I would put it, Gardener's Corner is a spot where you could have picked up or followed or met these women. It's so central. So for me, that was an amazing place for him to have been arrested. So yeah, mapped all the way up to 1909. He has a tremendously strange interaction. He always spoke weirdly with the judge who puts him away. If you read the book, you'll find out that in 1896 he proclaims that he's blown up London Bridge and takes all his clothes off and proceeds to walk down towards Leman Street. So he was there's elements of him that are extremely strange in terms of his behaviour, and how he acted. And he was not a nice individual. You're looking at over 50 assaults, as well as those attacks on Francis Jones and whoever else.
Yeah, not a very interesting, but not a very pleasant. But no, it's the one thing I noticed about the place. I was familiar with the stories. I'd not been to that area of London before we went and we did the tour. And actually, like you say, they're not a million miles apart. Those murder scenes. You know what I mean? They are. It's walkable. We walked all 5 of them on the tour, and funnily enough, we stayed in Borough. So your character there, we stayed in Borough when we were there. So we took the trip over from Borough to there, much like he will have done. Probably didn't take an Uber though, like we did. So yeah, so certainly a very, very interesting dark character, which ticks all the boxes. So in terms of the murders themselves, you say, you sort of said the chronological 5 or have you put it? Sorry, was there more that could potentially be attributed to him?
The murder file has 11 individuals, so there is a debate over who we would include. This term canonical 5, as the subject has progressed, we need to move on from that term, because even the original, where I talked about Bond earlier, believed that there was another victim that could have been added to that list. So personally, I think that Emma Smith, that claims she'd been attacked by 3 individuals, was the first victim, because this is all about geography and location. I would always say people, location. They're so closely linked. And then you have Martha Tabram. So if you add those to the canonical 5, you've already got 7. So I would say seven or possibly 8 murders for me are there. But you've also got possible attacks that occurred before. There's a lady called Annie Millwood. There's a lady called Ada Wilson. Annie Millwood died as a result of her injuries. She'd been stabbed in the lower part of her body, or the upper legs. So there are pre-victims that are discussed out there. So it's like with the Yorkshire Ripper, we still are discovering today, or we have recently, that there are some women that were disregarded at the time that were now believed to have been, or were known to have been, the victim of the Yorkshire Ripper. So I think a serial killer's methodology, or their modus operandi, evolves and changes. So we shouldn't necessarily dismiss sort of attacks because they don't exactly match what happened with the traditional group of women. We should always be looking. Within that file, there's an attack on a woman called Rose Milett. That was a complete and a murder that happened in December 1888. That was overlooked by Sir Robert Anderson, who was the chief of the top boss in terms of the police, and it was a travesty of justice. It was almost like they wanted just to get the Ripper thing out of the way, and that young woman's murder was never really investigated properly. But there's a lot to say that could have even been part of the sequence as well.
Interesting. So the thing that fascinates people as well, so someone who was very as aggressive as he was, why then did he stop? Why were the murders then brought to an end abruptly, or so we believe?
This is in terms of this subject. I think it's the most difficult question to answer. In terms of the individual that I've identified, it's alcohol that his ability to operate, it just goes on a steep decline. But even I would admit that you cannot match his alcoholic decline to the end of 1888 or 1889. He's still able to carry out robberies in 1892. So it's a difficult question. Some people say he was might have been incarcerated. it could be that a life-changing event at home in his personal life, whether or not he, suddenly settled into a relationship. There could be any number of reasons, but I consider myself more of a historian than an expert on serial killers, and I know that there are, from my colleagues of the subject, I know there are plenty of instances where some serial killers have literally just stopped, only to be discovered with new sort of DNA advances years later, after living normal lives for their past, X amount of years. So it's, how long's a piece of string? I think that question is really difficult to answer. What I would say, the answer doesn't lie in the view that he drowned himself in the Thames, which was one of the suspects, Montague Jewett, or that and a lot of my friends won't like this, that he was incarcerated in an asylum, as in the case of Aaron Kosminski, the Jewish suspect. I don't think that is the answer to this mystery.
Well, you brought up two there that I noted down to mention as well. So as well as Mr. Buckley there, like you say, I'm glad you said Montague's name, because I struggled to do that with the surname. So fair play. And like you're saying, Kaminsky as well. So what about the lines? Oh God, all these names, names are so easier these days. Francis Tumblety, then, he's an American with a documented hatred of women. He occasionally gets attached to the idea that he may very well be Jack the Ripper.
Yeah. I mean, the thing about Tumblety is that he was there at the time. I think he was lodging in, Batty Street, etc. There is a letter, the little child letter, that brings this suspect up and how they went over to America to look for him, etc. So he's a contemporary or near contemporary suspect in these murders. In terms of his attributes, I think he was actually homosexual. He was extremely tall, and I think his flamboyancy, he would have stood out a mile in those streets within the East End. He also liked to claim. Perhaps he's a bit like Trump, actually, in terms of how he liked to claim everything. Sort of an American equivalent from that century. And in terms of, I think he possibly tried to imply, from what I recall, that he might have been the killer. But no, I don't see anything other than him being a decent suspect, in terms of that he was known at that he was looked at the time. But his physique alone probably would rule him out, as well as his sexual orientation. I don't think. Now there's this aspect of collecting the wombs of the victims, the uteruses. In terms of Mary Kelly, that was left in the room. So that was raised early on in a lot of the in the first or second inquest that was the killer out. I think Wynne Baxter, that conducted these inquests, raised this issue. He'd seen that it was a possibility, but no, this was not related to Tumbleton. It wasn't related to the collection of female body parts, in my opinion.
And the other one, George Chapman.
George Chapman. When I was younger, I read a book. Still, I'd recommend it today, by Philip Sugden. Unfortunately, he died. He was the first true historian of the Ripper, and he wrote the history of Jack the Ripper. He believed that George Chapman was a good suspect. Now, in that book, and I'd say to anyone who want to look up George Chapman on the internet, or if they want to see a picture, there is a picture of George Chapman sitting with a sort of a seaman's cap on. He's got very dark eyes. Behind him I think there's two knives or swords crossed. And when I looked at that as a youngster, I thought, my God, that's the Ripper. That's Jack the Ripper. But he obviously was a serial killer in his own right, and he poisoned his victims, his wives. I think that he has been dismissed as a potential killer, mainly by some. There's a great Polish writer that wrote a story, that wrote a book about him, that's gone through the evidence. He would have, I think, he did arrive in the area at the time, or near time to the killings, but his way of operating in the later murders, his age, his ability to speak English when he arrived in England in the 1880s or 1880. It might have been just after the murder, but it's very close. And he's associated with some of the sites. George Yard, I think, claims that there was a barber's, I believe, the White Hart pub, where he was a barber. But no, but George Aberline, Inspector Aberline said Frederick Abilene said that he believed that he may have been, or you've caught him at last, when he was finally arrested for the murders in the early 1900s, wasn't it? For the poisoning of his wives. But for me, no. Again, and I think most people have dismissed him now because of great work that's been done on his history and his background. That would prove he's not the killer that was. But what a photograph! If you look at that photograph, and you'll think you're looking at the Ripper.
Oh yes, yeah, I am familiar with the photograph.
Yeah.
I do recall. I know exactly what you mean when you say that. Let's got one more name I want to chuck at you, and it's a little bit more fanciful than the four there that we've just discussed. H.H. Holmes, the guy from Chicago, the guy with the murder hotel, who found himself allegedly in London at that time.
Yeah, I mean, I think he wasn't actually in London. He wasn't in London at the time. But what's interesting about H.H. Holmes and Tumblety as well, in a way, is that there is a big audience for this subject in America, as we discussed, and there has always been a desire on the Americans, our cousins across the pond, to attach a little part of their home to a little part of our history, and I think that's what's behind that. So he's, a remarkable and evil man in his own way, but again, not connected to these murders on our side of the water. But I can understand why those links get drawn up, because you're going to have an American audience who says, "Oh Lord, it was one of us." Tumblety, it's possibly one of us, and it creates even greater interest in the subject.
I had a feeling you were going to say that. That was my take on it as well, especially at the start when we discussed the Americans who enjoyed the story. I thought, I've got a feeling I know why this man's is attached to it. So listen, I've really enjoyed this episode.
Me
I think
too.
It's fantastic. I really, really love hearing anybody who's passionate about history, or passionate about the subject they want to talk about, but especially history, especially a unique part of history like Jack the Ripper. It's something that's fascinated me since I was younger, and it sucked us in, and like you say, it's the very nature of the crimes, the very fact that it's unknown, and like you say, it was so celebrated at the time. Celebrated might not be the right word, but
I know what you mean.
Yeah, the way that it was put out there in the press, and this guy's name, he became famous by being infamous, and he was probably one of the first people to do that, I think, by the press. So it certainly captures people imagination, and I've really, really enjoyed listening to you talk. You're very passionate and very knowledgeable on the subject.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it. Obviously, you can tell that I'm interested in the subject, so it's nice to sometimes. It's almost like getting it off your chest. You could talk about what you want to talk about. So I've enjoyed it very much.
Oh, I'm glad. So before we let you go, I need to give you the opportunity to tell the folks who've listened where they can pick up your book and a little bit about it.
Yeah, so I mean, it's available as you say, in all good, through all good sources. All Amazon, you can look it up on Amazon. It's on Waterstones. All good booksellers will have it, so you can order it online. I think there's some deals going on it on Amazon at the moment. You can get the Kindle version as well. So in terms of, you may have your own views on the killer, and you may have your own suspect. In terms of where the book could be of interest to the general reader, is the history of the depravity and the gang culture and the low life, if that makes sense, of the East End in those three districts: Whitechapel, Spitalfields, and St George in the East. So read it for that alone, and then you can make up your own mind. I try to break down some of those common myths, the black bag, the cloak, the top hat, and then explain how they started. Those myths started. So read it for the history alone, I would say.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, like you say, I'm off on my holidays not long after we close off this episode, and I want, if I'm going to read a book, your pictures sold me. If it's just Dragons Den, I'm in. You know what I mean? It's the book I'll be reading.
I like that.
No, honestly, I hope a lot of people listening, I hope a lot of people go and buy the book off the back of this, because honestly, you talk passionately about it, and it's a different aspect to it. We've looked at the main candidates. This is something else, a little bit different, and as you've pitched it there, there's actually some pretty solid reasons as to why it just may be the reason behind the things that happened.
Absolutely, yeah. This is, as I say, the word genesis of the killer. This is how you'll see the environment that created that killer, as well as it created the women as well, but it most certainly created the killer.
Absolutely. So listen, Jonathan, I want to say thank you very much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure, but it just leaves it to me to close out the episode and say, well, I hope you found this interesting. I hope you go and buy the book. And we will be back next week when we will be talking about something entirely different altogether. Good night.
Friends around the mic, kicking back, alright. Day turns into night, podcast in the spotlight. Sipping on that brew, talking